Hey everybody, I'm Caleb and I'm so glad that you're here to jump into a really important conversation. Your student ministry is a place where you can talk openly and honestly about the real stuff you may deal with in your life. Sometimes that's the fun, encouraging stuff that helps us live the way God calls us to live, and other times it's the more challenging, difficult to process stuff that makes us wonder where God is at all. And today is one of those more difficult conversations. So I hope you'll stick with me as we dive in. Will it be easy? Probably not. But does it have the potential to help you navigate some pretty big parts of your life? Most definitely. So today, let's talk about grief. And first, just take a deep breath with me. Ready? Before we go any further, because I know this may sound like a really heavy topic. Maybe you're familiar with grief already, so you get it. Or maybe you've heard the word grief, but haven't experienced the feeling yet. Either way, I'm glad you're here for this conversation. Before we go on, let's make sure we're all on the same page about grief. I actually asked some middle schoolers what they thought grief was, and here's what they had to say.
For me, in my own words, grief is probably about just being sad about some things. Maybe you've lost someone. Maybe you're just sad about something someone said to you.
To me, it means pain of losing a loved one.
I think grief is angry or someone's not happy, they're very mad.
Grief for me, so I lost a good friend this year, but he will always remain in my memories. His light shined through everyone here, and I have just grown with my faith, and just all of that has been such a blessing.
I feel like grief is something that it's very hard on yourself, and it can be really hard to push through, but you just have to try to overcome it, and it will probably end up being for the better.
Grief kind of means sadness and just not always feeling yourself.
You have some big emotional moment happen to you, and so you can feel mad or sad, or you can feel depressed or anxious, and it's important to talk to people and let people know how you're feeling so that you can get through it with help from others.
Grief is that strong feeling that comes with the loss of something or someone you care about. I know that's a pretty basic definition for a really complicated subject, because the reality is grief is much more complex and can happen for all kinds of reasons. There's the grief that comes after a loss, like the death of someone you love, the passing of a family pet, or the loss of someone in your community or a person you don't even know, like a celebrity or influencer. There's the grief that comes in anticipation of a loss or major life change, like moving away or a family member leaving the home, or the reality that someone with a chronic illness isn't going to get better. There's even the grief that comes with disappointment, like not making the team, or your parents getting divorced, or someone not following through on a promise to you. Now, grief can show up in our lives in all kinds of ways because of all the kinds of loss. And honestly, it shows up with all kinds of feelings too. I know it's easy to think that grief only feels like crying and depression. A person grieving just feels sadness all the time. And a lot of times that's true. But that can come with a lot of related feelings like hurt, guilt, and powerlessness. Sometimes grief feels like anger. You get so mad, so frustrated, so angry, so resentful at the loss you've experienced that you feel less like crying and more like raging. Sometimes grief feels like fear. The loss you've experienced has caused you to feel alone or nervous or just worried. You have a lot of anxiety and it's consuming so many parts of your life. It might even feel like you're completely stuck because you don't know what to do next. For some of us, a loss is so unexpected that it can take you by surprise. You weren't anticipating what you're going through, and that has led to feeling super confused and thrown and just stunned. Sometimes grief feels like it takes over everything, like you're feeling every emotion at one time. It's hard to figure out what you're feeling because it's all just too much. It's like every emotion is hitting at the same time, and you're so consumed by the loss that you talk about it and think about it all the time. And then other times, grief feels like none of this. It just feels like nothing. In other words, it feels like you're numb. It can be so difficult to deal with and process the loss that you avoid the feelings of grief that come with it. Grief is so much more than just sadness. It's complicated and unpredictable. It's a deep sense of loss that fuels all kinds of feelings. And from those feelings come our behaviors. Maybe that looks like yelling at your mom or picking a fight with your brother, forgetting your homework or showing up late to practice, sleeping all day or not sleeping at all, binging your favorite show on repeat, feeling nervous or anxious all the time, not being able to concentrate, losing your appetite, showing up for practice or hanging out with your friends like everything is fine. You see, grief is complicated. It's personal. It looks different for different people in different stages of life, and it can change over time. One minute you might be laughing and the next minute you're just weeping. One year a holiday or a birthday may be hard and the next it might not. It's hard to know how grief will go with us as we grow, but here's what I know for sure. Grief will go with you. Just because time moves on and the loss may not be as painful or fresh doesn't mean you won't still feel it. You might always have questions about what caused your grief. Like, why did this happen to me? Why couldn't it have been different? What could I have done to change this? Where is God in any of this? That last one's a big one, right? Especially if you've grown up hearing about how God is loving and caring and kind and wants what's best for us. All of that sounds good and all, but after you experience a big loss, chances are you'll wonder if that's really true. Because what you're experiencing doesn't really feel like God's love, care, kindness, or what's best for you. In fact, it just feels awful. And if that's where you're at today, let me assure you that I have no plans of offering some magical quick fix to your grief today. I'm not planning to sit here and tell you one Bible verse or truth from Scripture that'll fix everything you're facing, because it can't. But what I can do is offer you the encouragement to know that you're not facing this alone. And more than that, I can tell you there is an answer to that question you may be asking, where is God when I'm grieving? And the answer is one that I hope will help you as you find your way through grief. We aren't the first people in the world to experience grief, and we surely won't be the last. Things like loss, disappointment, and pain are part of being a human. But fortunately for us, we have the real experiences of the actual people who lived thousands of years ago, who we read about in the Bible. And just like us, they experienced a lot of real grief and real loss. One of those people was Jesus. Jesus is God's son, but when he came to earth, he came as a man, a human being. That means God's very own son experienced all the feelings, disappointments, and struggles that we as humans experience ourselves. He had real friends, real relationships, and real losses over the course of his life on earth. And the experience we'll look at today was written by a guy named John, and it shows us just that. So, let's jump in. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So, the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Okay, here we meet a few important people: Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. These weren't just random siblings who met Jesus once or twice. These were his people, his friends, the ones he loved. They experienced Jesus in real ways and saw him do really amazing things to heal and help people during his time on earth. So of course, when Lazarus got sick, Mary and Martha did the one thing they knew to do: call their friend Jesus for help. Hearing that someone he loved was sick, Jesus did what most of us would do. He made the decision to go be with his friends. But by the time he arrived, the worst had already happened. Lazarus had died. Take a look at what happened next. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Lazarus' sister, Mary, was obviously grieving. And what I love is that she wasn't trying to hide it. She didn't pretend she was okay or convince herself Lazarus was no longer in pain or sulk and wait for Jesus to comfort her. No, she got real about the grief she was feeling right away. She basically asked Jesus the same thing I think we ask when we face loss like this: where were you? Because if Jesus had been there, maybe he could have changed something. Maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe they could understand why it did happen. Here's what else I think is so important about this passage. When a crying, grieving Mary got honest with Jesus in her grief, Jesus didn't get mad at her or tell her she was wrong or just ignore her. He didn't question her trust in him or her faith in God. Instead, he felt what she felt. He was sad, troubled, and deeply moved by their experience. So much so that this happened next. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." That's grief, right? It's so much more than crying. It's weeping. It's an experience of deep pain, deep loss, deep heartache. It's a sign of the deep love Jesus had for his friend, and I think it's important for us to remember in our own grief. Since Jesus is God's son, Jesus is a living, breathing example of what God is like. And because of Jesus, we don't have to wonder where God is in our grief. Jesus showed us exactly where God is when we're grieving, right beside us, weeping with us. Jesus meets us in our grief. He showed up for Mary and Martha. He wept with them over the loss of their brother, his friend. He didn't turn away or leave them to deal with it on their own. He stayed right there with them, weeping right alongside them. And I believe he does the same for us when we're disappointed, when we're hurting, when we know hard times are ahead, when we're walking through unexpected, unimaginable loss. Jesus meets us in our grief. Jesus actually said something else that I think can help us understand grief differently. In one of his most famous sermons, Jesus told his followers this: "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." When we lose something or someone we love, we struggle through the loss. We mourn, we weep, we grieve. But with that, we have the gift of knowing that we will be comforted, that we aren't alone, that God is with us, that Jesus meets us in our grief. Again, let me just say this. I know that some of you have suffered great loss already in your lives, and knowing God is there to be with you and comfort you doesn't change the loss or the feelings that go along with it. It may not change much for you at all, and honestly, it's not meant to, because the pain of what you've experienced is very real. I wouldn't ever want to pretend that one Bible verse, one prayer, or one visit to church could just fix that. But I can tell you that you're not alone. You're not abandoned. You don't have to figure it out by yourself. Instead, you can hold on to something and someone who promises to comfort you in your deepest grief and weep with you as you walk through it, because Jesus meets us in our grief. Since grief is a real part of life, it means we're all going to face it at some point. So, what can we do to help us when we get there? Here are a few ideas. First, acknowledge the feelings. What you're feeling is real, and it's okay to feel it. You don't have to try to move on or move out of it too quickly. In fact, one of the best things you can do is get real about what you feel in your grief. Don't be scared of those feelings. Don't rush through them. Be honest about them. Remember, Jesus wept in his grief, which was a very real response to a very real feeling. So, as you grieve, don't be afraid, embarrassed, or worried about responding in a real way. And then next, grieve however you grieve. Remember, we said grief is personal. That means how you grieve may be different than how I grieve. So, give yourself permission to grieve however you need to. Maybe you just need a good cry or a quick workout or time with friends. Maybe you need to scream and yell or be alone in silence. Maybe you need a journal or pray or just sleep. Whatever grief looks like for you, that's okay. As long as you're not hurting yourself or someone else, grieve the way you need to grieve. And then let's talk about your grief. When Mary experienced the loss of her brother, she opened up and talked to Jesus about her grief. When you go through your own grief, it's important for you to do the same. Talk to God and seek God's comfort, love, and peace. But remember, God also puts people in your life to support you when you do grieve. So, when you're ready, take a step to share your loss, your pain, and your feelings with those who can support and comfort you, like a parent, a family member, a friend, a counselor, or your group leader. Don't keep your grief bottled up. And lastly, remember that Jesus is with you in your grief. While this alone won't fix it, it can give us comfort. Somebody cares. Somebody is with us. Somebody understands. That somebody is Jesus, weeping alongside us. And as you grieve, Maybe you can say a simple prayer to remind yourself of this truth. Something like, Jesus, show me you're with me. Look for his presence with you in things you find comforting, in truth you find helpful, in people he puts in your life every day. And remember, grief looks different and feels different to everyone. This isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. If you have a friend or someone in your life grieving right now, a great question to ask simply is this: how can I help? This might feel awkward. You may not know exactly what to say, but showing up will mean a whole lot to them. Sometimes help looks like prayer and encouragement. Other times it looks like an invitation to watch a movie or play video games together. Sometimes it looks like showing up and listening to what they're feeling. And other times it looks simply like sitting in silence beside them and being there for them so they know they're not alone. Whatever it is, remember that God can work through you to comfort those who are grieving. And remember, Jesus meets us in our grief. So, as you head to your group, you'll be surrounded by people who care about you and want to help you navigate what you may be processing or grieving. And part of the way Jesus meets us in our grief is through each other. We can stand in grief with our friends the way Jesus does with us. So, I hope you'll do that today.